Hello and welcome to this inaugural episode of the Psychosocial Distancing podcast, lecture series, book read, whatever we want to call it. Today we're going to be talking about kind of an introduction to what social psychology is, starting into chapter 1 of the text. And the text can be available and will be available in all the descriptions. It's Stangor et al., 2015, Principles of Social Psychology, First International Edition. It's an open source textbook that anyone can access. And we're going to be going through this. We're going to start with an introduction and a little bit of history, talk about some famous and underrepresented psychologists. But first, we're going to introduce ourselves. I'm Daniel Chadbourne. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at New Mexico Highlands University. I focus on research regarding social identity, fan communities, UFO enthusiasts, whatever weird thing that they tell me I can't research, I suddenly find it's capable of researching. Probably, I guess most of my research has gone into kind of an 8-year review of the mostly male new My Little Pony fandom. And so I'm joined here with my co-host, Thomas Brooks. You want to introduce yourself?
Hello, hello. Like Daniel said, my name is Thomas Brooks. I am a graduate student in the PhD program at Texas A&M Commerce. It's an educational psychology program where Daniel actually graduated from. Most of my research is also centered around social psychology, but I primarily focus on the social cognition of human sexuality. So anything relating to sexual identity, all the way down to how we represent and remember and operate sexual behaviors through memory and experiences and interactions with culture. But also I'm kind of eclectic as well, so I don't just stay in my lane. I've done UFO research with Daniel. I've been to Furry Fiesta and anime conventions handing out surveys. Typically, I'm paid to do research in education. So I'm wrapping up a couple-year program right now looking at the influence of traumatic experiences on educational outcomes for elementary school students. And now I'm transitioning into a different job where I'm going to be looking at the impact of COVID-19 on graduate education. So I'm kind of all over the place. Hopefully I'll be graduating from my program within the year. Probably going to do something along the lines of terror management theory and human sexuality and get out of here and be an assistant professor somewhere.
It's the dream.
The dream.
So this kind of idea came out of a want to offer supplemental information kind of tied to free textbooks that we can offer our students and other people's students and anyone who wanted to sort of sit around and listen to us ramble about how different psychological processes tied to, in this case, we'll be going through a social psych textbook and eventually an introductory psych textbook, maybe a cognitive psych book, to talk about how a lot of these processes play out in sort of the real world. The way I have it sort of written down is that the kind of our goal is to use this kind of podcast in the loosest sense to go through a textbook in psychology, one chapter at a time, discuss topics and relate those chapters, not to just rehash and lecture on them, but to discuss them as supplemental information and possible real-world application regarding whatever we're talking about. So in this case, we're just going to be doing introductions, but for episode 2, we'll be going into social cognition. We'll be talking about the self, conformity, attitude change, probably multiple episodes on prejudice, attraction, and maybe some bonus episodes towards the end, talking about very particular research in psychology.
Yeah, that sounds like, what I was envisioning for this. One of the things I want to focus on, especially if for whenever I teach a social psych course, or even for my intro class, whenever we get to that, is kind of modeling what you do with a textbook, because you like everybody gets recommended or required readings for a textbook. You get your basic definitions in, and you're like, okay, so what? Now I can pass my multiple choice exam. But there's a lot of application and a lot of ways to take the information from a textbook and start looking at influences that are going on in your personal life, in the news, in your friend groups, or drama happening on the internet that really can be illuminated through information from textbooks that you don't usually quite get that connection built within the class with a lecture, because the teacher's usually too busy explaining the very minimalistic details to make sure everybody's up to speed to pass the exam.
Yeah, and especially when we're talking about kind of the traditional lecture model, both professors and students have this perception that you spend 12 years, elementary school to high school, told to sit down, shut up, listen to the teacher talk, and then you get into a classroom where you've got some young upstart assistant professor who says, "Hey, I want to have conversation today." And that doesn't really go over all that well. But with everything going on and all of us kind of working at a distance and teaching at a distance, this opportunity to have broader discussion and to discuss these topics outside of just regurgitating information, and getting into some of the bigger theories, getting them into some research lines that may be new or different without having to force people to read the research, which is just also goes over about as well as getting students to read a syllabus.
Oh man, they hate that.
And so our goal, at least for this first podcast, this first series, is to start with this social psych text, and like I mentioned before, it's Stangor et al. It's a first international edition for Principles of Social Psychology. And it's fairly good. It was published in 2015, so it's probably looking at maybe needing a bit of an update. But finding a several $100 textbook to utilize, it does its job, especially when trying to work with like lower income or just your average undergraduate student. I think most of us were in that position at that point. So my kind of itinerary for what I want to kind of do is while I don't want to cover just all of the definitions, it's probably best for us to at least define what social psychology is, talk a little bit about how it differs from some other fields in both psychology and outside, and then mostly to focus, we've kind of agreed to focus on in this first episode is to get into some famous social psychologists, so some with a more historical context. And as I usually joke that psychology is, the history of psychology is sort of bereft with a bunch of bearded old white men, to try to get away from that. And we've each brought sort of 3 non-bearded old white men to the table, so that we're each going to talk a little bit about some social psychologists, relevant historical social psychologists that we've researched in the time being. So I guess I'll start with the definition of social psychology. I'll give you my favorite definition, only because I like the very end of it, even though it is a very textbooky one. So it's the study of how individuals think, feel, and behave in relation to the real or imagined presence of others, and how larger social systems influence those beliefs, feelings, and behavior. And what I like about this one in particular is the real or imagined presence of others, because I think it really helps to emphasize and to kind of show, especially when I try to talk to my students about this, is that we're not just influenced by the people sitting around us or the people potentially listening to us that may have some sort of real direct connection, but also at a societal level, at a parental, familial level, that our parents don't have to be with us for us to feel the pressures of them standing over our shoulders, keeping us from dropping an F-bomb in the middle of class, or in
the
engaging
middle of a podcast.
in some particular behavior. And that essentially, so as social psychologists, that's kind of one of the core factors in which we're interested in, is how these systems, these larger social systems, ultimately influence the individual.
I also like that definition because it also accounts for people on the internet as well. Because there's kind of like a gray area between like, yes, they exist, but they're also not directly in front of you either. And so you experience that social pressure from people on the internet, um, even though they're not directly in your vicinity or even necessarily communicating directly with you, just watching the conversations on comment boards or on Facebook or something like that can start influencing the way that you perceive others, the way that you behave, whether you yourself determine that it's time to pick up a sword and jump into the comment section. That those kind of factors, that's a great definition because it also kind of leaves room for that experience that wasn't necessarily there prior to the internet happening when social psychology first started.
Yeah, I like to think as well about the imagined presence of others may also apply to what we'll eventually get into talking about with how, you know, having an anime avatar or a non-you avatar, you know, suddenly can have influence on your behavior, you know, in a way that if you're receiving very angry messages from someone online, it may even seem to be coming from a completely imaginary source, spouting really hateful things.
Wait, you mean Catgirl 69 420 is not real?
No, I'm sorry,
No,
Thomas.
they're not real.
They're not. So, but yeah, that this idea of the kind of broader systems in which we find ourselves in the same way that, you know, even if you do have a level of anonymity, you know, if you find yourself on Twitter or on Reddit or even on Facebook, I mean, Facebook might be a little harder because it's a lot of times tied to your name, but if you're
Mm-hmm.
on Twitter or Reddit, it's very easy to blend in, to lurk, to be just one of a large series of comments. And being
Mm-hmm.
part of those circles and part of those groups can have a drastic impact on your online behavior, which in turn can influence your in-person behavior.
Yeah, the frameworks and the ways that you learn to categorize social information and perceive the world and the stereotypes that get developed online often directly translate to the way that you interact with people offline. We see that with like adoption of language, so people starting to say LOL out loud, not just in text form. It's a very permeable boundary.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely have to tap into some really just off the wall lingo and jargon that's utilized and how it gets sort of picked up. And yeah, language in terms of the social context is, and I'm not entirely sure this textbook gets into it, but still a very fascinating, you know, especially again how these systems interact. And so a lot of this comes from the main focus of researcher Kurt Lewin, and Lewin is kind of considered the father of modern experimental social psychology, sort of modern social psychology, and by modern, and what are we talking about? You know, almost 100 years ago at this point. But, you know, sort of the beginning of the field. And part of it came out of his research that focused on this concept of person plus environment equals behavior. That understanding how the social psychologists sort of use the world is through this lens of, we see this behavior, and in order to understand that behavior, we need to know what's going on with the person, their individual perceptions, their personalities, their traits, whatever it may be, but also the social systems in which they exist. So who are they interacting with? What are their parents feeding them in terms of information? What media are they consuming? What people, you know, who are their friends at school? What is the school system like? How much money do they have? You know, all of these little details tap into the person. And it kind of gets us in this situation where you can have someone who may not normally act a certain way, or in situation A or in environment A may act very, very different than what we might expect to see in environment B.
Mm-hmm. So Lewin was a Gestalt psychologist, correct?
Yes.
And towards developing social psychology. So it's very much a reactionary area as opposed to behaviorism, which had the little black box theory where they didn't consider personality or internal processes at all. And one of my favorite quotes from Lewin is that a group is more than the sum of its members. which harkens back to that Gestalt idea that the individual pieces that make up a whole the whole is much more than what those individual pieces are, that the relationship and the interaction between those pieces creates something more than just the sum of the parts. And so translating that into social dynamics, I thought I particularly like that there's something a little bit extra spicy when you get people together.
Yeah, and that's a really good, point with that quote. Especially moving from kind of behaviorism to Gestalt and kind of combining these concepts. I mean, because even from a true behavioral lens, social psychology is still picking up on this concept that sure, we have operant conditioning and observational learning that's occurring, but it's occurring within the system. It's not just some kid watching their parent. It's beyond that. It's looking at what everyone else is saying, and then how that parent is influenced by their social system in terms of learned processes. And then we kind of take that to the next level and say, well, maybe it's not just the behavioral process. We do want to add some of the cognition. We do want to add some of the personality aspects. We do want to add these little bits and pieces from all of these different fields, but to look at it through the more societal lens.
And also kind of how not only how the environment influences the individual, but also how the individual then reinforces the environmental conditions that influence everybody else as well. And so that kind of gets into like the whole internalized prejudice research, where you start to internalize prejudices and stereotypes about yourself, and then you project those stereotypes and prejudices back onto other group members. And so it's a very dynamic system.
Yeah, especially when we're getting into, we're talking about that. I think we'll talk about that in the next episode, like projection bias as a type of social cognitive process. And as well, when those individuals, they kind of are influenced by the societal functions, they can become exemplars, leaders within their group, and then in turn start to influence the group itself, sometimes in ways in which the group was not like before, or very different than what we would expect that group to behave because of new leadership or new exemplars, new prominent individuals within those groups.
I will say, even though Lewin is considered the father of social psychology, the first actual social psychology experiment published was done by Norman Triplett in 1889. I'm sorry, 1889.
Well before
not 1989. And he looked at how the difference in how fast children could wind a reel when they were alone versus when they were in competition with another child. And he said the presence of another contestant serves to liberate latent energy not originally available. And so the idea that you need other people around you in order to behave in ways that you normally wouldn't in isolation.
That's sort of competition in its truest sense. Or I want to show off. I can do this better than this other person here.
Right. Yeah, no, it's very performative. I love liberate latent energies. Sounds like something Marianne Williamson would say now.
I mean, yeah, it kind of makes you think too that your motivation, especially in maybe completing something in grad school, is directly proportionate to how many stern emails you've gotten from your advisor. And so the mere presence of other people, even imagined or not physically present, can release those latent energies.
Or the comparative progress of other grad students.
Yeah, as we get into things like social comparison later on, at how we compare ourselves both positively and negatively to others, the definite motivator and a good example of how some of these processes play out. Yeah, so if we were to take something like the triplet study, or kind of Lewin's concepts, or any, I guess, social issue that we have today, I don't know, let's pick something quasi non-controversial, or completely controversial if you would prefer.
This is 2020, everything's controversial.
So let's take something like the social study of protest movement and how people respond to it. So if I'm looking at this from like a social psychology lens, I'm interested in identity research. So I might be interested in how one's identity as So we could look at political identity. We could also look at racial identity. We could probably look
Regional
at
identity.
regional identity would be a good one. Whether or not there is a protest in your town or not, and how you might view those protests would be a way to look at how a person's community, region, group membership can change their perspective of how they view, whether or not they view the peaceful protest versus the rioter label, whether they're more likely to use that particular terminology. And so as a social psychologist, we would be, quite interested in that interaction, and not just how they viewed it, but what outside factors, what societal factors, what systemic factors, what potentially individual factors are influencing their kind of ultimate, the language that they use, and how they view these protest movements. And so if we were to compare that to other fields in psychology, like personality psychology, so how would a personality psychologist tackle that, or a clinical psychologist maybe tackle something like this? Might be a little more difficult of an example for that. But how something like a personality psychologist or a cognitive psychologist or even a behavioral psychologist would approach this differently than sort of that social perspective.
So from the outside looking in, I would probably project that a personality psychologist would be more interested in the latent personality variables that would make someone more likely to engage in protest. And so they would look at things like extroversion, or social justice ideology, or openness. Yeah, low neuroticism, stuff like that. But then they would look at people who disapprove of protest and probably say low openness, high neuroticism. And so it kind of looks at individual factors within the individual without necessarily taking the entire context and the other people involved into consideration.
Yeah, and so kind of ignoring the people perceiving them.
Right. Or how, having like putting up Blue Lives Matter or something like that on your Facebook, what kind of social reward you get for doing that within your own circles, how you are perpetuating a group norm within your Facebook feed.
And much in the same that if we looked at this from like a cognitive perspective, it would be looked at, that very, very much as sort of what's going through that person's head, what kind of thought processes, reward, motivation, may be influencing someone to finally stop and say, nope, I'm getting up and going to protest today. I'm going to post this really angry diatribe on Facebook to say why all these protesters are terrible. Trying
to look at that decision-making process.
Yeah. And so not necessarily, again, looking at how the person interacts with the system, but also how but how the person is kind of interacting with themselves. And we'll eventually kind of get into a little bit with social cognition, but mostly in terms of how that these thoughts influence perceptions of the environment as opposed to just the thought processes themselves.
So how would that differ, say, from a sociological approach to understanding protest?
Yeah, and so I guess if we wanted to move it beyond and move into like sociology, anthropology, or even like a criminal justice, so other like behavioral-esque sciences that aren't psychology, we may look at this in terms of the group itself. And so a sociologist would be more interested in how the group functions, what the entire group structure. So it wouldn't be looking at the person or how the person fits or is influenced by the group. And they're this kind of back and forth mutual interaction between person and group. They would be looking at the structure of the group itself. So the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole. Or if we're going back in time, something like the Occupy movement as a whole, not just the individual members and how they're influenced or how they, join, but the norms and the larger aspects. And there are some branches of sociology that get a little closer to that person-environment interaction. But for the most part, it's more global. It's more macro versus where personality would be a little more micro, and social psychology is kind of somewhere in between.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a fairly gray field. And it touches into a lot of other different disciplines of study. That was something that I found while doing my thesis, was that I ended up having to draw a lot of information from sociology to kind of establish what cultural trend I was talking about in order to look at how the individual interacts with that cultural trend. And so they kind of, the two fields very much feed each other in that way.
Yeah, I mean, much in the same way that you could probably find some interaction with like anthropology, and I did my master's thesis kind of bridging psychology and anthropology, looking at more historic systems through a psychological lens, to see how, maybe how we can glean some understanding. It's a lot more difficult because those systems in many cases don't exist anymore, or exist in very rare or very small units compared to kind of the similar systems that we're examining today.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that both amuses and perplexes me about our previous department head, who does what is it? Cognitive archaeology, looking at Neolithic peoples and kind of the tools and fragments that they left behind and inferring cognitive ability. And I'm like, whoa, we're in a totally different context to understand that.
And is really good friends with my master's thesis advisor, who writes books on how human ritual behavior created the human mind. Very, very evolutionary psychology, and looking at kind of how these systems may have changed over time.
Just projecting it back into the past.
Yeah, and trying to, and much like we would say, like a social psychologist today would try to kind of pinpoint what was going on that may have caused this. I mean, there's definitely a social motive there of saying, hey, we had these early humans engaging in ritualistic dance and behavior. It may have helped for pain reduction. It may have forced them to bond together more. We actually have research that shows that joint interaction. You could see it a lot with research on like units in the military engaging in cadence calls and shared marches and whatnot as ways to bond as a group, and so then trying to extrapolate that and say, well, our ancestors, we have evidence of this ritual behavior, and it may be where a lot of this started, these early signs.
Right. I wasn't going to bring this up because I did not prepare for this at all. But I've been following. Yeah, I've been following this YouTuber. I believe it's called Angela's Emporium, and she's a academic in Britain who does research on the occult. And she interviewed a psychologist recently whose dissertation looked at the effects of distance pagan medicine rituals on people's health outcomes, where they had it was like a double-blind randomized experiment where they had a witchcraft practitioner do a ritual at a distance for somebody's X ailment. And the interesting thing is that if we looked at this from like a social psych perspective, there wasn't any significant differences between the groups because all of the groups saw improvements over time. And so understanding that ritual happening might have influenced the way that they behaved and the outcomes that they had because of that perceived other that may have done said ritual to improve their outcomes. I'll have to go back and find who that researcher was because it was very fascinating.
And we could tie that into some social cognition discussion next time.
Yeah, no, I'll bring it back up. I'll actually go on ProQuest and see if I can find that dissertation.
So outside of it's just kind of introducing what I guess we do and what other social psychologists tend to do, and researching social psychology, and not to continue on maybe boring people with the actual research methodology side. I'm sure there are plenty of people who find it interesting. I have a couple of students every semester who really enjoy my research design class and my stats and my stats class, but they're very few and far between. I think mainly, again, the topic isn't as glamorous as talking about protesting and how that applies in terms of psychology or political identity differences in individuals. That's far more glamorous than saying, all right, this is what a correlational study is.
Right.
And so to kind of go beyond that, the other big thing that this first chapter delves into is at least a discussion of some of the history of psychology. And so I wanted to use the rest of the time we have to talk a little bit about some of the big names. And when we talked about Lewin a little bit, to talk about some of the other big names in social psychology, some of the names that might come up over the course of this series or over the course of the book if you're reading along at home. But to also bring up a couple of extra individuals that either the book isn't going to cover or is going to cover as a citation somewhere, but not really talk about their influence on the field. And when talking about influence, I like to bring up one of my favorite quotes in psych. I'm going to butcher the quote because I don't have it in front of me, of course. I'm about as prepared as I am for a standard social psych lecture. But it's a quote that essentially says this: the social psychologists claim that, if we had to thank one person for the development and the further study of social psychology, that person would have to be Adolf Hitler.
Oh,
and
my goodness.
as much as I have to constantly preface this with, I do not want to defend or support Adolf Hitler. You
have a job.
I do have a job. And I've had my job warned by people on Twitter for less, one of the things that we look at in terms of this is really that World War II brought up a lot of questions, and that a lot of these early psychologists were doing research either kind of during or post World War II to answer some of the big questions of the human condition, not in a sense of what makes people tick, but what could drive people to certain behaviors. And, much in the same way that the field of clinical psychology had a bunch of people step forward to really help post-World War II to deal with troops coming home with what we now understand as PTSD, and we see the creation of the VA. What we have here is an example of these psychologists stepping up because there are people who have questions. How could this happen? Can good people do bad things? Are these all just terrible people? I mean, there's another... I remember when talking about conformity, I was writing some textbook notes, and there was a person talking about when we look at like the average Nazi soldier, and trying to explain as carefully as they could in this textbook that like we don't want to make the Nazis seem good, but we have to understand these larger social systems that are in place to kind of lead or potentially lead to some of this behavior. That being said, there are people who would argue like a lot of these soldiers, had no choice and whatnot, but it's also been known historically that these soldiers had outs. There were soldiers who were transferred out of working at concentration camps. They had these options too. Why did some of them, and why did some of them that arguably may have not have been these inherently violent monsters that we might portray them as? Why did some of them stick around? Why, or could we take someone who maybe wasn't, laissez-faire about harming someone, but put them in this situation and see them do it?
And it's also kind of a preventative research too, because if we go around and just constantly demonize, say, Hitler, for example, as the worst human being on the planet, no one else is like him, this could never happen again, we kind of blind ourselves to those environmental influences that could then lead us to behave in very similar ways if we distance ourselves too far from the events that happened in World War II.
Yeah, I try to give my students a warning at the beginning of social psychology that we're going to cover a lot of heavy stuff because social psychologists delved into a lot of the worst. Like they look at why people engage in these behaviors, and what they might find is that a lot of these processes that we engage in are adaptive, are beneficial to us in our day-to-day lives in some way. So something like schemas, and a stereotype is a type of schema. So these shortcuts that we use to categorize things, they help us make it through our day with minimal cognitive effort.
Right.
But they can backfire on us, and they can cause us to maybe view an entire group of people without looking at the individual. And so, there's a lot of this potential negative research or this negatively themed research, which is why I always try to end with the pro-social behavior chapter whenever I'm discussing these. But part of understanding something like prejudice and conforming pressures that might cause someone to harm is ultimately about preventing, as you said, trying to prevent these effects from happening or learning about it. It's kind of that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Well, we want to not just learn about the history, but we want to learn about the processes that led to that history so that we can also avoid them as well, or at least hope to avoid them as well.
And that kind of takes it a step further than, say, like legal psychology or clinical psychology, who will just attribute all of these terrible things that people do to the individual to either get them isolated from society or, medicated so they don't do those things. And they don't necessarily always think about the cultural, social factors that led to and facilitated and encouraged that behavior in the first place.
Yeah, and you could see that too in a lot of, I guess, more modern programs where there is a focus on trying to understand background and like the most up-to-date versions of the DSM, getting into social factors that can lead to symptoms of a variety of disorders, or how things like poverty is probably one of the largest predictors of psychological illness for the function of the stress that it causes and the lack of being able to afford treatment.
Right.
And so these social systems are a pressure, a high predictor of what's going on. So with that in mind, I guess let's get into maybe talking about a couple of these. I have a couple of names written down. There are a lot more. I figure we'll talk about some more of them as we make it through. Really when we think of like the conformity research and the post-World War II research, I mean, probably the biggest name that comes out of that is Milgram.
All hail.
I was mentioning to you as we were kind of prepping for this that it'd be really interesting to do a Milgram episode compounded with a Zimbardo episode, as they're both these really famous, prominent psychologists who had very different paths for their research, that both of their research got really famous, but Milgram's is the one that probably holds up the most as far as replications done to prove his point or to support his hypotheses, really delving into a lot of the underlying variables and underlying mechanisms associated with that. And even though we know him for the conformity research and the studies that he was doing, he's still got a litany of other research that goes beyond that delves into probably the most prominent, other than the conformity research, is the urban overload hypothesis, that says that people in large cities are so bombarded with social information that they start tuning it out. And so when someone says all people in big cities are rude, well, it turns out that if you just bring them to a small town,
they relax
just like everyone else. That it's the stress of all of that social information that's coming in.
And then we also have the dark specter of Zimbardo haunting social psychology.
Yeah, and I mean, the Stanford prison study is still one of the most famous. I mean, they're still making movies and stuff about it because it's a sexy study.
It's way cool.
It's a really cool study. It's some of the documentaries that have been made on it are really interesting and informative. I mean, the idea that you can put a good person in a bad situation and cause that person to act out likely would hold up if replicated better, if you could ethically replicate that study outside of the one big replication done in the UK.
And they did more of a social identity perspective on it, if I remember correctly, that they actually, whereas Zimbardo was just kind of like, oh, it's just the environment. The UK study actually went in and was like, okay, what does it mean to hold the identity of the guard and of the prisoner, and how does that influence the behavior?
And it's surprising that there's a documentary that I've typically showed my class. It's one of the early documentaries they did on it. They brought the people back. They had interviews with Zimbardo, with the members within that study. And the guy who played, they called him John Wayne in it. The prison guard who went by that name says in the interview, I just saw Cool Hand Luke. I just saw this at the movie. They had this gruff prison guard. He was really, stern and kind of describes this personality. And he's like, I just kind of wanted to do that. And mentions that like his understanding, not necessarily the environment, but you could argue the environment influencing that role, caused him to sort of lose himself in that role, or at least adopt that role temporarily. And so his identification as prison guard in that study likely exacerbated some of that.
Yeah, it's not so much, and that's kind of where we get into the Tajfel research, where it's the environment, but also it's kind of the environmental identities that we take on that also influence the behavior as well.
Yeah, and Henry Tajfel and his graduate student, was it John Turner, focused on social identity and self-categorization theory, probably the biggest influence to the research that I do and you do as well.
Yeah.
That this idea, Tajfel's kind of initial research was done on what's called minimalist groups. I find these really fascinating. I love the idea that he brings people into a lab and flips a coin, or shows them two pictures and says, which one do you like the best? And if you say you like picture A over B, well, you get put into group A over group B. And so you have these randomly assigned people into randomly assigned groups on the most minimal of criteria, and you find that they show in-group heterogeneity, out-group homogeneity. That my group is more different. The outside group, they're those people over there, the heads on the coin flip, they're more like one another. And that even just with the simplest categories, we find ourselves, in this, I want to say tribalistic, but this group, my tribe versus their tribe mentality of we're more diverse, they're more alike. We're better, they're worse. Right. And then there's definitely this, maybe underlying reason, if we go back to former department heads and thesis chairs, that there may be this adaptive reason for us to do that, in a time where we had to compete over food or water or anything like that we may have developed this tendency to do that. But in a time where we're more interconnected than ever, this kind of minimal group identity can get us into trouble, because we may be picking fights with other groups for no reason, because drama. We perceive them. Right. And a lot of that can be left up to even just perception. Do you perceive this person for being in another group? With the perception, I can kind of move us into another. There's one that we'll talk about. I think it's chapter 3 or 4, Fritz Heider, and Heider's dichotomy. It's kind of a very famous social psychological, I guess, theory, with attribution theory. Basically says that when we perceive those other people's actions, so we've got these out-group members, and they're behaving a certain way, or
it's their fault.
Yeah, I'm sitting at home. I'm not protesting. Why are these people protesting? Well, we have two choices. We can say it's because of who they are. Some personality factor. Why are they acting like this? Why is that
a bad attitude?
Right.
They're ungrateful.
I usually use the example of, you're at a grocery store and you see a parent lose it on their kid and spank them in the middle of the store.
Ooh, that's good.
Why do they do it? And I picked this because I worked at a grocery store for 4 years. It was
I'm sorry.
It was a fun time. But we actually had an incident where the police showed up.
Oh.
And we didn't call them. And so we were like, hey, guys, what are you doing here? They said, well, one of your customers called us. Apparently, a parent had swatted their kid with a broom. Or, I mean, not a broom. A hairbrush that they had in their bag.
Oh.
And, again, like none of us really saw it. We don't know how hard. We don't, it from what it sounded, it didn't seem like this parent was like brandishing this hairbrush and like beating their kid in the middle of the store.
Right.
But the perception of the customer who called the police was that's what was happening.
Parents, yeah.
And so, again, they see this parent act out this way, and they have to decide, well, why are they doing it? So is it because of the internal process, the internal disposition? Is it because this parent is acting this way? Or is it because of the environment? Maybe parent got laid off of work. Maybe they're having a rough day.
Maybe they had to go to the grocery store before they could cook dinner, and so both mom and the kid are starving and irritable.
Yeah, everyone's hungry, everyone's grumpy. The kid's acting out because maybe they've been stuck at school all day. So it's either situational or kind of internal, personal. And what attribution theory has noted is that when given the option, we typically say it's personal. And again, it's not tied to this kind of always willing, conscious effort in doing so. In most of the case, it's because we don't know that person. We don't know what their day is like.
On a more positive note, we also look at people like celebrities or scientists or well-known like global figures, and we go, oh, they're so amazing for personal reasons. Like they're just innately genius, or they're innately, good-hearted. And we don't necessarily attribute all of the environmental factors that led to them being in that position in the first place.
And you say positively, but that could have a negative connotation.
It could be negative as well.
Especially if we're giving someone credit for something that they didn't work for, or they didn't really need intelligence or maybe a high, level of some positive personal quality to achieve. It's not to say that people don't. And don't move into, positions and whatnot based on talent and skill and practice and a variety of other things. But
how it could also be nepotism.
Right. How we view those individuals can heavily depend on, the attributions that we place. And because we don't know every detail of their lives, we don't know their upbringing, we don't know where they've come from. And with someone like a celebrity, we might be able to get around that. If you know a lot about them, they've written a biography, we can kind of say, oh, like they did make it based, despite their situation, or, maybe their situation did have this effect on them. But with other people, it becomes a little more difficult because we can't read their minds. All right, so outside of we talked about Milgram, Heider, Lewin, anyone else come to mind in terms of, I guess, sort of famous historical psychologists before we kind of move on to some underrepresented, prominent individuals in our field?
We could talk about the sheriffs.
Yeah, that's Muzaffar. I'm not sure if it's pronounced Sherif or Sherif.
Sherif.
Yeah, he and his wife, both prominent, historical social psychologists. They're famous for the Robber's Cave study, looking at group composition, arguably reduction of prejudice once that prejudice is handled. I like to look at them as a good example of why a lot of the hopes of desegregation among social psychologists were very wrong. A lot of social psychologists basically saying, hey, we're going to bring people together. We move you into the school district. You'll get to meet non-white people, and suddenly you'll start liking non-white people. And it turns out that contact alone wasn't enough.
Well, wasn't the point of the Robbers Cave study not so much that it was contact, but also that they shared a goal?
Yeah. So what they once they kind of created this competitive conflict between these two kind of Boy Scout type groups, they found that just bringing them together didn't do it. They had to do things like create common goals. So they sabotaged the water supply for the camp, and both groups had to work together to bucket water out so that they could replace the pipe. They had to help push the bus that broke down on their way back to camp. Conveniently broke down on the way back to camp. Did find that mutual cooperation, having shared goals, working together on equal grounds, which eventually led to other research that backed this up in other fields. So you're not going to see prejudice reduction amongst like an employee and a boss,
right?
But amongst two equal status employees, you can see some reduction because they're of equal status. They have similar goals. Other things like repeat interactions. So just meeting that one person from another group may not do it because they're an exception to the rule. So meeting other people and a number of other people. one of the big benefits of something like the college system, or just getting out and interacting with people who are not typically part of your in group, can be really beneficial because it can help break down some of these barriers.
Right. And that's kind of topical as well, because currently we're having an issue with our current president who's talking about the indoctrination of our students. And I'm like, it's probably that you get a bunch of diverse people in the same room and put them all at the same level of power that they can cooperate together.
Yeah, my favorite tweet that I've seen about that is someone saying, if you really think we're indoctrinating our students, you try getting 150 freshmen to read the syllabus.
Oh man, seriously.
If we can't get them to do something as simple as read the text,
whatever I say in class is not taken more than with a grain of salt, except to pass a test.
And I mean, that doesn't mean that there may be some people who are maybe stepping over the line in terms of what's appropriate or inappropriate to say in the classroom. But I once got on a teacher evaluation that during the fall of 2016 in my social psychology class, I talked about politics too much. And it wasn't that I was talking about politics in relation to a particular candidate. I'm just more of like, this is the political system. This is how it applies to social psychology, because it's all out in the open during an election year.
Right. Like 2020, thus this podcast.
Exactly. And so, yeah, that there's this perception that, maybe I was pushing a particular narrative, but in reality, talking about things like political advertisements in terms of attitude change, how the music that you listen to in an advertisement is made to sway your mood state to get you to think differently about a particular candidate or something like that there's this this application, this understanding of some of the stuff that we're talking about in relation to these topics. But it is important to understand those other perspectives and understand those other groups and have these conversations, even if, I don't know, maybe they're uncomfortable for us sometimes.
Right. Yeah. And honestly, one of the things, so I'm working on a term paper right now, looking kind of at the relationship between student retention and academic dishonesty. And one of the things I found, there's this theory about the culture of complaint that academia is under right now, where it's kind of bred by this idea of like students treating their degrees like commodities that they're purchasing. And so when you get into the commodification of education, you start getting the Karen mindset where if you're not satisfied, you complain to the manager. And that kind of culture is influencing the way that professors are teaching right now in very much a harm reductionist mode, where there's a lot of self-censoring of your own political beliefs going on in class because you don't want to deal with the fallout of a student complaint.
Yeah, and it sounds, I mean, especially when we think of like the degree in the university system, I mean, this is a whole nother discussion on academia,
right?
as a commodity, as a business model, that there's definitely that. And I mean, there's maybe some credit to viewing, how a student might come to view it like that when the cost of college is so much more than it used to be. If you're going to go into debt to get your degree,
no. And that's, I'm more favorable towards the theories that don't center the student as the problem for that, because a lot of it has to do with the way that the university is trying to balance budgets and like do customer outreach to increase tuition rates so that the university can stay afloat because austerity, politics, etc. So, but that's kind of something related to the way that the culture influences the behavior, is that there's a lot of self-censoring, and a part of the academic dishonesty problem is that professors aren't likely to take up and defend grade disputes as much anymore.
So interesting. I've been pretty lucky thus far. I've only had one grade dispute in my 10 years so far teaching, and that grade dispute was for a student who so blatantly plagiarized,
right,
that no one was listening to their appeal, like that there was no real argument.
And that is the appeal of Turnitin.com, because it gives you a neat little black and white percentage score to help with grade disputes.
Yeah, and I wasn't using it at that time. That's how blatant it was.
Oh, man.
It was just so obvious. They copied paragraph by paragraph.
Oh.
So I guess moving on. I mean, there are others. I can bring up Leon Festinger, but I'm going to bring up Leon Festinger, and I think chapter 5 or chapter 6, a lot more in depth. Is just one of the more interesting studies when it comes to how do you get people to leave cults? Why do people stay in cults or in really bad situations? Why do we stick with really bad belief structures or ideas, even in the face of overwhelming evidence? Festinger is kind of our go-to for that. And then we'll talk about, we talked about Zimbardo a little bit. We'll talk about him, and then when we talk about conformity, we'll talk about Solomon Asch, who did some of the earliest conformity studies with matching lines.
Yeah.
And so with that, we'll kind of lead into kind of the end of our discussion, where we're going to bring up and talk about a couple. We've kind of assigned ourselves 3 non-white, male, I guess non-traditionally discussed psychologists or underrepresented psychologists in the field. And it's sort of an interesting thing with psychology that it was a historically male-dominated field. I don't know the full numbers off the top of my head, but the last I had looked, I think we're something in the range of 65 to 80% female with incoming psychology. It's pretty high. I know that most graduate programs, the graduate program that I got my master's degree in, and that was 10 years ago at this point, I was one of 2 guys in the class, and one of them dropped.
Oh, wow.
And that we were about 75% female cohort. And the current program that I'm teaching at now, our graduate program, it's over 50%.
We might be over 50% at A&M commerce, but it would be close. There's a lot of dudes.
Yeah. And I mean, part of it, I think, comes down to, and we could maybe talk about this in a later chapter too, of the social system, the system of viewing maybe psychology as a soft science makes it easier than some STEM fields of being ostracized. Social science as well, when it comes to some of that ostracization. I'm butchering that word today.
No, I butchered it.
Yeah. The dismissal of particular groups of people is maybe a little less in fields that study it. I know some of the research that looks at how professors respond to emails based on name, that if you have a non-white sounding name, that even at higher level, you go to Harvard, you go to these big institutions, these professors in these really competitive programs are still susceptible to this type of behavior, but you see it less in some of the social sciences. And again, it may just be that it's more in our mind. We're more aware of some of these factors. And there could be a number of reasons, but psychology today is definitely not the realm of, or at least not the dominated realm. But there are a number of, factors I would still argue probably within our field that are having an influence on things like that.
Well, for example, one of the things that I was reading this a long time ago, but one of the differentials between men and women in psychology is that women tend to take their psychology degrees and go become counselors, school psychologists, and get into the very applied clinical areas, whereas men tend to go up into the research and become the professors. And that's still overrepresented in men in terms of like who's actually training the future psychologists.
Yeah.
Men are still having the advantage there, but you're right in that more women are in the program. They're just not quite making it up to that top tier as much.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to maybe we'll look for some people for a future episode to have a discussion, especially with not 2 guys talking about it.
Right.
We don't want to be that news panel of 5 old white guys talking about women's issues in politics.
Right.
So yeah, that having this discussion, and it would be really important to kind of delve into some of this, because that does affect it affects who are we learning about, who are we talking about, who are we focusing on in terms of research, whose ideas are flourishing, who's getting published. And so that with that in mind, I'm gonna let you go first and bring
Okay.
up your first of three
Okay, my first of
historical
three.
psychologists.
So this one's kind of cheating, but my first one is going to be Magnus Hirschfeld. So he was Jewish in Germany, and he was actually exiled from Germany with the Nazi rise. So not totally a white dude, but I wanted to bring him up because his nickname is the Einstein of sex. So he was born in 1868 and he died in 1935. He was a physician and he kind of established sexology. And one of the reasons I add him to the social psych pool is because his work directly tied to the social influences of human sexuality, and that was very much a part of integrating an understanding of human sexuality. So he built the Institute of Sexual Research in 1919 in Berlin. And the Institute housed several physicians whose predominant role was to assist in gender transition surgery for transgender people. And in fact, he actually coined the term transvestite, which has then transferred and we now refer to as transgender. Transvestite is now considered something completely different. But he and his partner, Carl Gies, lived on the second floor of the Institute. They had a museum of sexology that was available to the public. And a lot of his work dealt specifically with the public litigation against transgender and homosexuals during the early 20th century. And it was surprisingly, I found that he was inspired to do this because of the trial of, what's his name? Oscar Wilde. Going on in England at the time. And so he founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which worked with legal institutions across Europe to decriminalize homosexuality. He was a part of the first decriminalization of abortion and the first wave feminists at the time. And eventually he had to go into exile into France because the Nazis rose. They burned down his institute. I believe there were over 20,000 books on human sexuality and gender diversity that he had been collecting and writing up to that point that were housed in that institute that were all just burned. And so he had to flee Nazi Germany into France, and then he died before the Nazi occupation of France due to a heart attack. So that's my number one.
I don't know if I can compete with that. So my number one, and I kind of waffled on a couple of people to kind of fill these positions, but my number one, and mainly because of the research that she helped to kind of break down, was Carol Gilligan. And so she did a lot of research in regards to, she got a PhD in social psychology in 1964. She's actually still doing research.
She's still alive?
Living. I think two of my three are still living.
Oh, mine are all dead.
But they're really prominent in terms of, when we're talking about even, social psychology isn't vastly old. But Carol Gilligan got her PhD in 1964. She's currently a professor of humanities and applied psychology in New York University Steinhardt. And she's probably most well known for her research, both working with like Erikson and Kohlberg and breaking down some of Kohlberg's perceptions of morality and moral development. And so, I mean, I'm only really a fan, I guess, of Kohlberg's moral development because of my favorite moral dilemma that he proposed. And I'll pose this to you in the audience, that you find yourself in Nazi Germany. It's pre-rise of Adolf Hitler, and you find yourself in a bar with the chance to effortlessly steal Adolf Hitler's wallet. You don't need the money, and stealing his wallet will not give you any identity or change the course of the war. Are you morally obligated to steal Adolf Hitler's wallet?
No.
And so what Kohlberg would say is that depending on how you come to this decision would determine what your level of moral development. So are you at this kind of young level, everything is right and wrong. Everything is black and white. There is no gray. Level 2 is kind of you follow the rules of society. So it's against the law to steal, so I don't steal. It's not really a right or wrong thing. It's just it's against the law. And I apologize if my neighbor's motorcycle that he's just been revving for no reason all day is picking up on my mic. And then the final stage is more kind of like post-operational type, more higher, advanced development. You're kind of coming to this decision like, well, it's not going to change anything. He's not the Hitler at the end of the war. Like,
right. Yeah. That's kind of where I was at.
The moral dilemma does say that it's going to ruin his night.
I got you. Well, I mean, I guess it just, I probably would
karma.
just take a hedonistic approach and just be like, well, if I feel like it, then maybe I will, but.
Right. So the problem with this, and this is what Gilligan brings up, is that Kohlberg, focusing on these stages of moral development, was almost a majority male sample.
Oh.
And so there's this problem. And so what Gilligan argued is that the kind of social systems and norms that may influence moral understanding in men are going to be different than women, or different in, from boys and girls. So she argued that moral decision making takes place on a different voice than by men, and she came to characterize male morality as more rule based, and female morality as from a more like care perspective. And so, but basically showed in her research that this kind of one-track view of morality doesn't hold up, like Kohlberg said, in these sort of neat little developmental boxes, that things are more complex, that based on, and I think we can make an argument that, what she's looking at here is, and someone will tell me that I'm completely wrong and misrepresenting her research, but that basically this idea that the social systems that influence men and women differently, especially if you're going to go back to the early 70s when she was doing some of this research, 60s and 70s, are going to impact our understanding of something like moral code differently, based on what is acceptable and unacceptable, what is seen as masculine versus feminine, whatever it may be.
Yeah, we have to consider the scripts.
Right. And so she has had some, opposition. She's definitely not. It's been very influential, but not immune to criticism. That basically some say that you need more empirical support. There's that usual thing, but also like probably her biggest arguments have come from like that almost same issue you could have with Kohlberg, is an almost essentialist view of things, that basically saying that this kind of adds to the little blurb that I was reading from, said that she has been charged with essentialism and giving aid and comfort to the patriarchy. By basically saying that this is how men think about morality, this is how women think about morality, this is how it is. But we can kind of take a step back and look at it from like a social system. The social systems that say this is how boys are, this is how girls are, is likely to also influence how we perceive moral and immoral action.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's aiding and abetting the patriarchy.
Really good quote. But yeah, she's really, really prolific in terms of publication, academic books. I wanted to kind of highlight that. One is a way in which, ideas change, especially amongst, potentially prominent individuals in psychology. Or we take someone like Kohlberg, who's typically talked about in most Psych 101 textbooks, and it's kind of glossed over the fact that a lot of his ideas about moral development were deeply flawed, especially in terms of his participant samples, and that you have this research that kind of moves forward and helps to develop a broader understanding of morality, which probably leads us into a lot of the moral research today that looks at a lot of how these different cultural systems impact that.
One of the things that this reminds me of, and she probably is a part of this movement, but in my Death and Dying course, one of the things that we focus a lot on is the transition from stage theories to thematic theories. during the 60s and 70s because everybody's a fan of the Kubler-Ross model of the process of dying. But it's super duper incomplete because a lot of stage theories like the moral development theory or the psychosexual stages or what is it, Erikson's developmental theory, like people don't fit neatly into discrete boxes, and they especially don't fit neatly into discrete boxes when you expect them to jump from one to the other in a linear fashion.
Right. I mean, especially, we can have a whole nother conversation about Erikson. I like it. I like talking about Erikson in a positive way. But yeah, like the stages and yeah, that definitely, offers some credence. Her research ties into the credence that there's this, we can't just put everyone into especially with social psychology being very weird, as in Western educated, rich, industrialized, and democratic, that we have this problem that we're doing a lot of research with college students that can we apply this? Are we applying it correctly? We kind of have the reverse problem now, that because we have, I don't know about you, the last big research project I did in the classroom was about 70% female.
Oh yeah, no, that is a problem.
It's sort of flipped what we might look at from this research in the 60s and 70s that was 90% male.
Yeah, it goes back to all the women in psychology, because most of our samples are from psychology courses.
Right.
I made a joke at the last SPSP I went at when I presented my sex script data, because I specifically did like white heterosexual men, and I was like, my participants, social psychology's favorite lab rats, white heterosexual men. But I'm using them on purpose. They're not default. They got a big kick out of that. All the women in the room, because it was mostly women. So my number two?
Your number two.
My number two. So my number two is Evelyn Hooker. She was a social psychologist who worked during the 50s. The context around her, she's an American psychologist. And she was a part of the major push to get homosexuality removed from the DSM and declassified as a mental illness. And so in her study, The Adjustment of the Male Overt Homosexual, she took two samples of men, one who identified as homosexual, the other one who identified as heterosexual, and she paired them by age, education, and IQ. And then she delivered the TAT, the Make a Picture Story, and the Rorschach test to all 60 participants. And she used the Rorschach test because at the time, that was believed to be like the number one measure to determine if someone was gay or not. Like, the Rorschach was the gaydar of the 50s. And so she anonymized all of these case studies of the 60 participants, and she gave it to 3 clinical psychology professionals to sort these men into gay and straight, depending on the mental health that they observed in the case studies based off of these questionnaires. And all 3 of them failed to be better than chance. And so with that research, she demonstrated that gay men were not more likely to suffer from mental health conditions, or that there was some sort of innate mental health condition related to sexual orientation. And so she received the award for Distinguished Contribution to Psychology in the Public Interest in 1991 because of this work. And then she received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the APA in 1992, which is the highest award that one can receive from the APA. And so her work really broke down that whole individualized clinical psychology perspective of sexual orientation, and really opened up the field to start looking at other avenues of research with sexual orientation and more factors related to it. So she was very much very important, because obviously Hirschfeld's research did not continue after the Nazis burned his institution down. So she picked up a lot of slack that was lost from the Nazis.
Yeah, and just leave it to the Rorschach to be no better than chance. There's actually still a university that teaches the Rorschach.
Mine?
Oh, no, I meant like really, I mean, there's, I forget the name of it, but there's one that I remember reading this study or this history of it, and like now that they've developed it into like the 16 block grid and it's meant to be more empirical.
Oh yeah, no, I'm taking my last class right now. It's in higher education because the Rorschach class kept not making, but the professor who teaches it just updated the entire class for that new model because they use it in the clinic here.
Oh no. Okay. I don't know how I should respond to that.
I'm very disappointed. I really wanted to learn how to do it.
It'd be
that would be
interesting.
Fascinating. And I kind of wanted my own inkblot cards.
Yeah. So
the original Gaydar.
I'm sure there's something we can do in the future with social identity in the Rorschach.
So that's my number 2, Evelyn Hooker.
So I guess kind of tied to these sort of early this early research into these kind of psychological fields. I can't really talk about one person in this case. So these are 2 psychologists, and they're kind of intertwined in their research and their acknowledgement. But this is Mamie and Kenneth Clark. Speak correctly. So both the first African Americans to receive their doctoral degrees in psychology from Columbia University. Their influential research focused on child development and the influence of societal factors on children. Very specifically, they're most famous for the doll studies, the studies that showed that Black children were more willing to play with white dolls over black dolls. And this was attributed to the negative connotations within society towards Black individuals, which transcended to their children. Essentially, if you have a society that's putting down one group of people to a high degree, that's segregating, that's discriminating against a group of people, their children pick up on that and still prototype white as better. And when given the opportunity to play with these dolls, they found that, where white children were more likely to pick the white dolls, Black children were also more likely to as well. And it was kind of viewed out of this social lens. Their research was actually cited in the Brown versus Board of Education case that went before the Supreme Court, and it was actually arguably important as they were asked to testify as expert witnesses in several school desegregation cases and regarding Brown versus the Board of Education, to basically show scientific evidence of the negative repercussions of segregating groups of people or treating 2 groups of individuals as so different from one another because of the color of their skin.
Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, they caused quite a bit of stir in the APA for that participation because the white bearded male psychologists were like, "Oh, we can't get political with our science."
I mean, that's obviously changed since then, huh?
Yeah, no, totally different.
Scientists are supposed to be apolitical. Things like that. That there's this again, you're kind of pushing back against what is perceived. I mean, much in the same way that I would imagine that your 2 researchers that you've already talked about were kind of likely seen by members of the psychological community in the same way. Are you talking about this stuff? Like we have this understanding. I mean, we're talking about sex in an age of Freud, and so you're going against that because like this is all about pleasure drives and repressed memories.
Your mother.
Right. And that if you're going against, and then there are plenty of examples of this within the kind of history of psychological research of people kind of going against the norm with really good research and taking years to get anything published or anything accepted because they're going against the common trend of the time, or they're going against this one established researcher who has might have several publications, dozens upon dozens of things written, but they find research that questions it, because we're even not immune to sort of the biases of our own effort and what we put into our work. So it creates these roadblocks for
for Hooker, like she did that research in 1956, she didn't receive those awards till the early 90s, and she died in 1996. So she didn't get them until like the last 6 years of her life, like acknowledgement for that work.
Yeah, and a lot of the big acknowledgement and awards as well, are looking at. I'm trying to see if I could find some of their awards in my notes, but a lot of them, especially recognition in the APA, wasn't something that happened in the 60s or the 50s. In that, when we're talking about them getting their degrees, we're talking about them getting their degrees in like the 50s and 60s, and then in I guess the late 40s to 50s, if they're cited in the Brown versus Board of Education, which is rare for not just non-white but women to receive their degrees at some universities in the United States at that time. That they're really kind of breaking away, and then they went on. Kenneth Clark became the first African American tenured full professor in City College of New York, and it was also the first African American to be president of the APA. And so it took time, and maybe some fields were breaking those barriers faster than others, but there's plenty of these stories of really prominent, really important work being done that won't find it in a Psych 101 textbook. I mean, we can't bring up a lot of people in a short textbook anyway, but prominent individuals, famous non-3 or 4 people who are always talked about.
Right.
And that bringing them up, I mean, especially looking at how influential they were, not just in the psychological sense, but also in the legal and historical sense.
Yeah, because the world would be completely different without the Clarks or Hooker that we live in today. Like, Freud is great, but he didn't quite change the world or our day-to-day lives like these other researchers have.
I mean, he fought for psychology. We can give him that. And
we can give him that.
His daughter really helped with the formation of a lot of defense mechanisms, which is pretty good. Defense mechanisms are cool. But other than that, not a whole lot of Freud. I mean, outside of cultural influence, really sticks around in the field, especially when we go outside of clinical psychology. Once we get into social psych, we don't ever talk about Freud, except to bring up that everyone talks about Freud.
Right. That's the first. We're not talking about Freud, guys. I'm sorry. Let's see. My number 3 is Ziva Kundra. So Ziva was an Israeli social psychologist who specialized in social cognition and motivated reasoning. And so she was one of the researchers back in the transition from behaviorism to social psych and cognition who did a lot of writings about the black box problem with behaviorism and how they're not considering all of the factors. And so she was one of those voices and one of those authors who really helped push the narrative for the need to expand psychology beyond just the behaviorist perspective. Let's see. And then her 2 most influential pieces of research came a little bit later in the 90s and the early 2000s. So in 2003, she published an article called "When Do Stereotypes Come to Mind and When Do They Color Judgment?" And so this paper looked at how stereotypes influence the way that we judge and interact with other people. And she found that we don't necessarily always use stereotypes to inform our decisions and our interactions about people, that we can, like, even though we may hold a bunch of stereotypes about a specific group, when we interact with a member, we usually interact with them as an individual. And so, like you said earlier, they become the exception to the stereotype instead. She also found that stereotypes can change, but they change incrementally. And they usually change within the context that makes sense of the original stereotype to begin with. And so it's not so much that you can get people like to switch stereotypes like on and off, but you can get them around a stereotype using the internal logic that they've already established, which goes into her second publication from, or I guess this one came before the other one. This one was in 1990, which was The Case for Motivated Reasoning, where she found that humans typically arrive at their conclusion and then adopt justifications only if they work with their internal logic. And so generally when we make a decision or we establish a stereotype or we make a perceptive judgment, we go with what we like and what feels good, and then we only keep it if we can internally justify it to ourselves post hoc. And so she argued that assuming that our own reasoning and other people's reasoning as being objective plays into the self-affirmation bias, and so that we needed to move away from this idea that humans are completely objective actors and that we start with the beginning and then we logic our way to a conclusion. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We feel our way to the conclusion and then we argue our way back to the starting point.
It makes me think it reminds me of this really early model of decision making. I'm trying to pull up real quick while I talk. This really early model of decision making that was tied to what's it called? Like early economics. So it was not really I think it is called the economic man-woman model. So it was tied to early economics, and it basically said like the average consumer is completely rational and objective. And they take everything into consideration before making a purchase or a decision. And so we shouldn't feel bad if they get cheated because they've thought about things completely
that sounds like capitalist
through.
Propaganda.
Yeah, it was kind of one of the earliest like pre-psychological views. And no, there's no way. And I mean, and her research emphasizes that there's this, there's this view that we're purely 100% objective, and we can be objective. We can be very rational, reasoning adults at any point. But it takes effort. It takes energy, and so yeah.
And I think the way that we set up our own consumer advertising market. Because I want to get into Edward Bernays later on in the podcast, the nephew of Freud, who is the father of public relations. He took Freud's like psychoanalytic pleasure theory and applied it to advertising to circumvent people's logic.
Yeah, there's a long history of early psychologists going into advertising, and it's not
good money.
Yeah, but not necessarily good for the consumer.
No. So, and just another side note about Ziva. She was not awarded the Scientific Impact Award from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology till after she died.
It's just like finally recognizing individuals for their work.
Yes. So going with our theme of unrecognized people.
Now, I'll end on a high note of someone who I think is very recognized within the field. Though I'm as I said before, I'm ashamed of not getting into her work earlier because of how influential it is in terms of identity and self. We tend to be focused, and our lab was a little more on the group as opposed to the individual self. But this researcher is still alive. She's actually well honored and established. The last convention I went to before pandemic lockdown, she was the guest speaker at our pre-conference, is Brenda Major. And Brenda Major is currently a distinguished professor at University of California, Santa Barbara, in the Department of Psychology and Brain Sciences. She's held numerous positions at a number of universities, received a number of awards, and has authored more than 200 articles in social psychological science, as well as a number of books. Probably the two biggest things that I kind of highlight that, and again, it's hard to take her vast interests. I'll kind of read from her bio, everything from how people cope with prejudice, discrimination, devalued social identities, stressful life events. She's particularly interested in the psychological resilience and how cultural ideologies, such as the American dream, shape people's likelihood of perceiving discrimination, as well as their cognitive, emotional, and behavioral responses to perceived discrimination against themselves or others. Some of her more recent research particularly looks at like white identity threat. Her current research examines the impact of perceived ethnic gender and weight-based stigma and discrimination on psychological stress, health behaviors, and interpersonal relationships, and has delved into anti-bias norms and groups. But the articles, or the two kind of series of bits of research that she's most, I guess, that have become some of her more influential and controversial work, have to do with first her research on prejudice and prejudice, identity, and resilience. Typically, at the time, and this was back in the 80s, she published a paper. Let's see if I could pull the name up. Crocker and Major, 1989, is probably the most famous of the group from a historical perspective. It's Social Stigma and Self-Esteem, the Self-Protective Properties of Stigma. So before this, we typically had this view that stigmatized groups were always taking hits to self-esteem. If you were part of a stigmatized group, you were in a worse position because of it. But what her research found is that if you have a strong sense of group identity and your stigmatized group is bonded together in some meaningful way, so you have, let's say, like a prominent minority community to fall back on, it can buffer some of those effects of stigma. That essentially things like prejudice and discrimination, their effects can be buffered through resilient effort from one's community or from one's cultural or ethnic background. And that wasn't necessarily well received at the time. Because there is this implication that you can say, well, oh, maybe prejudice and discrimination isn't so bad, or to try to play it off as if she's saying that, you know, these groups shouldn't worry so much because the stigma is not as bad, or it's buffered in some way. But what it does show is the effect of having a kind of strong sense of community and having these people that you can fall back on who have experienced similar things, who have been through what you're going through, and how powerful that can be for overcoming some of these larger institutionalized systems of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that she's a little more recently known for, and this has become even more controversial for her, specifically outside of the psychological community, is a lot of her research on abortion and mental health. And in particular, along with a number of colleagues, did this sort of overview of all of the research on mental health and women who had undergone a specific legal single first trimester abortion, found that there was no difference in mental health outcomes compared to women who didn't, basically helping to disrupt a lot of the myths around the negative implications, the regret, the psychological trauma of going through this procedure, specifically a safe, standardized procedure, as opposed to what was being done before the legalization of abortion.
Right. Yeah.
And it does make me think, because, you know, you talked about Hooker and whatnot, looking at like these aspects of abortion and, interactions. I mean, especially going back to really early studies on sex and research, examining, getting into these realms of research that would have been very, I guess, unsavory for the average psychologist, because of the worry that they're going to receive pushback from their own community, from outside of the community, that if you look at how people protest abortion clinics, you can only imagine putting out positive research showing that the negative effects maybe aren't as bad as some people are claiming there are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, one of the things that I noticed, particularly with mine and even yours, looking at the destigmatizing of people getting abortions and how it's kind of like a throwaway that, oh, you're going to have mental health concerns. It makes me think of Foucault's claim that we put a lot of like icky, sticky topics like abortion and sex and stuff like that. Like those conversations happen quite a bit, but as long as they're within their safe little squares of like clinical psychology or within legal conversations and stuff like that. And so when you have researchers that say, nope, you don't have this is not your area. Like, this needs to be opened up for other people to talk about. Like, that usually gets a big reaction from the public.
Yeah, and especially that and it also even seems that when we look at some of the people that we've talked about, I mean, even beyond what can and cannot be discussed, there does seem to be a wide array of the types of research that they're doing in terms of looking at other groups, other perspectives. That's sort of the big argument as to why things like diversity of ideas and individuals and backgrounds, especially in a social psychology field, is important. That having a bunch of old white men at the table, for lack of a better phrase, is ultimately limiting us. And if we can go back further, I had in my notes for historical psychologists people like Francis Cecil Sumner, who did a lot of the early research on prejudice. And, I mean, sure.
He was the advisor for the Clarks, right?
Possibly.
I think he advised Clark.
I'd have to continue to look it up. Yeah, he was.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm just throwing stuff out.
I do remember that he worked with Stanley Hall, and Hall was really big with finding specifically people from underrepresented groups and being like, hey, come and join my program. That trying to get more representation. And again, I mean, that's who do you want doing the early research on prejudice? Do you want
the people doing the prejudice,
someone
or the
like
people
me
receiving the prejudice?
this white guy from Southern Louisiana, or do you want Francis Cecil Sumner? I mean, outside of just capacity to maybe do amazing research, maybe you still want Sumner. That you want someone who has more insight into those perspectives, who knows the questions to ask and how to ask them and how to approach members of that community, because who's that community going to talk to as well? If we're trying to get them to open up, they're not going to talk to me. They're going to talk to Sumner. They're going to talk to someone that they feel maybe safer with, especially if we're talking about research being done in the 50s or 60s. Anything post Tuskegee.
Right. Yeah, no. And like, if the whole point of your branch of psychology is to consider the environmental factors, you probably need a diversity of thought to paint a clear picture of what those factors actually are.
Right. And we see that a lot with we do a lot of fan research, and even just, I don't want to conflate the two, but going into these communities, it's important to understand them, especially if it's a community that we don't know. I mean, I learned an awful lot when talking to people really into studying UFOs. And it's because I went into that community with a very different understanding than the reality of what that community was like.
That's what happened with me when I started doing the furry research, and going in, and now I have furry badges, and I go to the convention every year. Hopefully it'll be open next year, depending on pandemic. But I went in with totally different expectations of who the furries were, and now I'm like, oh, y'all are actually pretty cool. Like, they're not cool, but they're, not sexual deviants.
Right. So with that kind of concludes our overview. I mean, there are thousands of other psychologists that we can get into, but I'm pretty sure we're already breaching an hour and a half.
Yeah, I know.
That I'll have to cut down a little bit.
Social psych diatribes.
Yeah. So this is kind of, I guess, some insight of what's to come. And in our next episode, we're going to start delving into social cognition. And in particular, on our docket, as a little preview, we have things like Freud's nephew. Thomas wants to bring up social media bubbles and confirmation bias, the news and the availability heuristic, false consensus bias, and political hostility. And one of our ideas is we have this wonderful spreadsheet of basically every bias that's ever existed. We might just go through them and talk about biases, because social cognition is awash with the way in which we perceive our world and why we tend to fall back on a lot of these automatic processes that, while they can be helpful, get us into trouble. So with that, thank you for listening, and goodbye.
See y'all later.